It was a quiet Saturday morning when the envelope arrived. The kind of morning where sunlight poured lazily through the blinds. Dust particles hung in the air, and the coffee machine hummed in the background. I wasn't expecting mail that day, let alone a letter that would flip my entire life upside down. The envelope looked official, thicker paper, bold lettering, and the dreaded return address stamped neatly in the top left corner. Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Now, let me make something clear. I've never been on good terms with the HOA. For years, they had hovered like hawks over every blade of grass, every paint shade, every flower planted in my yard. Too bright a mailbox? Fine. A shed 1 inch. Taller than their regulations? Fine. Once, they even fined me for having my trash bins visible for an extra hour. It was relentless harassment. But this letter, this was different. I tore it open and unfolded the pages, skimming over the stiff, legalistic language until my eyes landed on the number. $250,000. That was the total amount due in fines and penalties for multiple ongoing violations of HOA regulations. My hands froze. I blinked twice, convinced my eyes were playing tricks. $250,000? For what? My heart raced as I scanned the list of violations. An unapproved storage shed. Fence not conforming to community. Color guidelines. Excessive foliage encroaching on common property. Driveway cracks not repaired in a timely manner. Unauthorized modification of the property boundary. The last one made me pause. Property boundary? That didn't even make sense. I dropped the letter on the table and paced the kitchen, fury boiling in my chest. They couldn't seriously expect me to pay this. It was laughable. No, it was insulting. But the HOA wasn't laughing. The letter was stamped with a bold red notice. Failure to pay will result in legal action. That's when the fear crept in. These people had power. They could put liens on properties, drag homeowners through endless court battles, and even force foreclosures. But here's the thing they didn't know. I wasn't about to be bullied. Sat down with my coffee and pulled out a thick folder from the drawer. Over the years, I had quietly collected every document tied to my land. Titles, surveys, property deeds. I had them all. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. I'd always suspected the HOA was overstepping, and now staring at that ridiculous $25 okay fine, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Determination. That night, I spread the papers across the dining table like a detective piecing together a crime scene. Hours passed as I flipped through legal jargon, survey maps, and deed transfers. Then I saw something odd. The original property deed, dating back decades, clearly outlined the land boundaries. Not just my house and yard, but a much larger tract. And according to those boundaries, the entire subdivision, the neatly trimmed lawns, the sidewalks, even the HOA's beloved clubhouse sat squarely within my property lines. I sat back, in my chair, stunned. My pulse quickened as the realization sank in. The HOA wasn't just fining me for nonsense. They were fining me on my land. Land that legally I owned. That letter demanding $250,000. It wasn't just an insult anymore. It was the spark that lit the fire. I wasn't just going to fight the HOA. I was about to turn the tables and make them realize that everything they claimed to control actually belonged to me. The morning after the HOA meeting felt unusually heavy. Mark woke up with a headache that wasn't just from lack of sleep. It was from the humiliation he felt. He had lived a simple, peaceful life on his property, and suddenly, a group of people with clipboards and smug faces had decided he was the enemy. As he poured his coffee, the sound of the mail truck stopping outside drew his attention. He walked to the mailbox, hoping it was just bills or advertisements. But there it was, an official envelope with the bold HOA seal stamped on the front. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a thick packet of papers. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Notice of violations and fines, $250,000. Mark nearly spilled his coffee. He blinked twice, thinking maybe he had misread it. But no, the words were as clear as the morning sun. Violation number 1. Unapproved fencing material. $25,000 fine. Violation number 2. Unauthorized vegetable garden. $50,000 fine. Violation number A. Storage of non-conforming equipment. Tractor. $30,000 fine. Violation. #4. Failure to maintain landscape. To HOA standards. $40,000 fine. Additional penalties and accumulated late fees. $105,000. The total sat at a staggering $250,000. His hands trembled. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered. "No way they can fine me this much." But the letter was clear. If he did not pay or comply within 60 days, they would pursue legal action and even place a lien on his property. For the first time, Mark felt fear. The HOA wasn't just trying to control his garden. They were threatening his livelihood. His land wasn't just a home. It was everything he had, the legacy his father left him. Asterisk, as Mark flipped through the thick packet again, his eyes caught something odd. On page 17, buried in the legal jargon, was a line that read, "Violations apply to properties within the jurisdiction of Greenfield Homeowners Association, as described in the Declaration of Covenants filed with the county recorder's office." Mark frowned. He had lived on that land for decades, long before the HOA was even formed. He was never given any Declaration of Covenants when he bought the land. His property was rural farmland that his father had purchased outright years before the neighborhood even existed. So why was he suddenly under their jurisdiction? Asterisk. Instead of panicking, Mark felt a surge of determination. If the HOA wanted to play games, then fine. He would read every single word of their rules, every legal clause, every map they filed. He spent the rest of the day digging through old boxes in his barn, pulling out deeds, survey maps, and dusty folders left behind by his father. What he found made his blood run cold. According to the original land deed, his property wasn't just a house on the edge of the neighborhood. It was the parent lot. The neighborhood itself was carved out of land that had once belonged to his family. And then he noticed something unbelievable. The HOA's covenant maps didn't match the original county survey. The HOA had mistakenly, or perhaps intentionally, drawn their boundary lines over his property, not in simple terms. They were fining him for living on land that they technically did not own jurisdiction over. And if his deed was right, he might not just be outside their authority. He might actually own part of the neighborhood itself. Asterisk. Mark leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. Suddenly, the $250,000 fine didn't look like a punishment. It looked like an opportunity, because if the papers were correct, then the HOA had just picked a fight with the man who might own the very ground beneath their homes. And Mark wasn't planning on backing down. Asterisk. The day of the HOA meeting arrived. By the time I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, the evening sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns and cookie-cutter homes. The very sameness of it all felt suffocating. Each house looked identical, each flower bed manicured to precision, as if the neighborhood itself was a prison dressed up as luxury. Inside the clubhouse, the air was thick with whispers and judgmental glances. The HOA board members sat at a long oak table, stacked with folders, violation notices, and a jug of cold water that no one touched. At the center sat Gerald Whitman, the HOA president, a man who carried himself with the arrogance of a king in a crumbling castle. His silver hair was slicked back, his suit pressed sharp, and his eyes the kind that never smiled. "Mr. Davis," Gerald began, his tone clipped, as if even saying my name was an inconvenience. "We're here to address your repeated violations and the substantial fines you now owe. The HOA will not tolerate continued disregard for our community rules." A hush spread across the room as neighbors leaned in, eager for drama. I sat down calmly, laying out my folder on the table. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm here because I believe you've overstepped your authority. These fines are not only outrageous, they're unlawful." A murmur rose from the crowd, but Gerald silenced them with a raised hand. He leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk. "Unlawful? The HOA has the power to enforce community standards. If you don't like it, perhaps this isn't the right place for you to live." His words stung, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I opened my folder and slid a few documents across the table. "Before we go any further, perhaps you should take a look at this." Gerald's smugness faltered. His eyes scanned the paper, then narrowed. The other board members leaned closer, whispering among themselves. "What is this supposed to be?" Gerald demanded, his voice cracking slightly. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. "That," I said slowly, "is proof that the land this entire neighborhood sits on, including every house, every road, every so-called community space, was never properly transferred to the HOA. It still belongs to me." The room erupted in gasps. Neighbors exchanged confused glances. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with a glimmer of hope. Gerald, however, turned red with fury. He slammed his fist on the table. "This is absurd," he barked. "Some old deed doesn't change the fact that this community is run by." But his words were shaky now, his confidence rattled. I had pierced his armor, and he knew it. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so the room hushed again. "You fined me $250,000 for so-called violations. But as of right now, you're all trespassing on my property. Every single one of you." The silence was deafening. For the first time, the mighty HOA president didn't have a retort ready. He just stared at me, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against the oak table. The meeting ended in chaos. Some neighbors rushed to Gerald's side, while others approached me quietly, whispering questions, curiosity in their eyes. I laughed without saying another word, but I could feel the shift. The power dynamic had cracked wide open, and deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Gerald wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat. No, this was the opening move in a much larger game. A game where the stakes would climb higher than either of us imagined. I sat in my small office the next morning, staring at the mountain of paperwork that had arrived overnight. Letters from the HOA, formal notices, and threats of escalation. It was all there. But what truly caught my eye wasn't from them. It was an old, dust-covered envelope I had dug up the night before from the back of a cabinet. Inside lay the original property deed my grandfather had left me at first. I skimmed it, assuming it was just another document confirming my little slice of land. But then I noticed something strange. Instead of showing boundaries for just my parcel, the deed outlined a massive block of land. Roads, cul-de-sacs, sidewalks, parks, the entire neighborhood. My pulse quickened. Could this mean what I thought it did? I cross-checked the deed against the county maps. And there it was in black and white, my grandfather's name, and now mine, as the legal owner of not only my plot, but of the entire neighborhood's foundation. The HOS playground? My land. The sidewalks they were demanding I maintain? Mine. Even their shiny clubhouse with the smug community signboard? Mine. I laughed out loud, a bitter, almost disbelieving laugh. The HOA wasn't just fining me for violations. They were fining me for changes I made on my own property that technically stretched beneath every single one of their homes. The implications hit me like a storm. If I wanted, I could charge them rent. If I wanted, I could restrict access. And if I really wanted to push things, I could legally dismantle their entire existence. But before I could celebrate, another thought chilled me. Maybe the HOA already knew. Maybe their aggressive campaign wasn't just about my little shed or my chickens. Maybe they were trying to push me into selling the land cheaply. Before I realized its true worth, I leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above me. The story wasn't about fines anymore. This was a war. And now I held the nuclear codes. Still, I had to be careful. If I revealed my hand too soon, they'd bury me in lawsuits, smear campaigns, and maybe worse. But if I played this smart, I could turn their arrogance against them. So I made a plan. Step 1, gather evidence. Step 2, expose their hypocrisy. Step 3, make them pay. Not just in fines, but in every way possible. As I slid the deed back into its envelope, I whispered to myself, "You wanted a fight? You just picked the wrong landowner." What I didn't know was that the HOA president had already begun digging into my family history and was about to uncover a dark secret that even I wasn't aware of. Asterisk. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My coffee sat untouched on the table as I stared out the window, watching the perfectly trimmed lawns and neat driveways of the neighborhood. Everything looked too polished, too controlled. It was as if the HOA had turned this place into a movie set, where appearances mattered more than reality. But after last night's discovery that I might actually own the very land under their feet, I knew appearances would soon shatter. Still, I had to be careful. One wrong move and they'd bury me in lawsuits before I even had time to breathe. I decided to test the waters. Instead of charging into a legal battle, I thought I'd push the HOA in small ways, see how they reacted. And so, I grabbed a notepad and started writing down experiments. My first idea was simple. A permit request. I filled out a form asking for permission to install a small shed on my property. Nothing extravagant, just a 10 by 10 space to store tools. Normally, HOAs love to nitpick these requests. They delay, add conditions, maybe even outright deny it. I wanted to see if their arrogance held up when the ground beneath their arguments might not legally be theirs. 2 days later, I got my answer. The HOA's president, Miss Carol Whitmore, sent me a rejection letter. Her reasoning? The shed does not conform to the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I laughed. Aesthetic harmony? These people thought they owned the right to control even the shape of my backyard storage. But I didn't fight. Not yet. Instead, I filed a second request, this time for a driveway expansion. Again, denied. Then, I asked to plant a row of trees along the edge of my yard. Denied. Every no they gave me was another piece of evidence, another rope tightening around their necks. Because here's the twist. If my lawyer's research was correct, not only did I own my lot, I might actually own the common areas too. That included the roads, the sidewalks, even the manicured park they proudly used for their annual barbecue. But I couldn't reveal my hand yet. I needed them comfortable in their power trip, so when the truth hit, it hit like a freight train. The real crack in their armor came a week later. The HOA decided to hold their monthly meeting. Normally, I never bothered to attend, but this time, I showed up, notebook in hand. The room was packed with neighbors, some angry about fines, others begging for exceptions. All of them quietly resentful of the board. Miss Whitmore sat at the front, smug as ever. She banged her little gavel and began the meeting. That's when I noticed something odd. During the financial report, the treasurer stumbled over his words. He mentioned rising maintenance costs and unpaid legal bills. Then he quickly shuffled the papers, moving on before anyone asked questions. But I caught it. Unpaid legal bills. That was my first glimpse of weakness. The HOA wasn't the unshakable fortress it pretended to be. They were bleeding money. And if my land ownership claim turned out to be true, I wouldn't just win a battle. I'd dismantle their entire empire. After the meeting, I cornered the treasurer in the parking lot. A nervous man named Paul. He looked like someone who regretted ever volunteering for this nightmare. Rough meeting, huh? I said casually. He sighed, glancing around to make sure no one overheard. You have no idea. This HOA, it's drowning in debt. Between lawsuits, upkeep, and all the nonsense Carol pushes, we're barely holding on. My heart raced, but I kept my face calm. Sounds tough. Ever think about what would happen if the HOA didn't own the land they're managing? Paul frowned. What do you mean? I smiled faintly. Just a hypothetical. Then I walked away, leaving him with a seed of doubt. That night, I called my lawyer again. He confirmed what I had been hoping. The deed he uncovered wasn't just a fluke. It was real, binding, and older than the HOA itself. The HOA was standing on my property, and soon they were going to find out just how fragile their empire really was. Asterisk, by the following week, Ethan could feel the tension thickening in the air every time he drove into the neighborhood. Eyes lingered longer. Whispers followed him from porch to porch, and a strange hush fell whenever he passed by. The HOA wasn't just mad. They were rattled. That suspicion was confirmed one late evening when Ethan, returning from a meeting with his lawyer, noticed several expensive cars parked outside the community clubhouse. The windows glowed with a sterile light, and silhouettes moved back and forth inside. Curiosity tugged at him. It was a Wednesday night. No official meeting was scheduled. Ethan pulled over, cutting his headlights, and crept closer. Through the window, he saw the HOA board members gathered around a long oak table. Papers were spread out everywhere, some of them maps of the neighborhood. Their voices rose and fell, sharp with frustration. We cannot let him pull this stunt, one voice hissed. If the residents find out he owns the land beneath their homes, they'll revolt. Then we bury it. We find a way to discredit him. No one can know. Ethan's heart pounded. They weren't just trying to find him anymore. They were conspiring to destroy his credibility. Suddenly, a name popped up that made him freeze. What about Samantha? Another voice replied. She's his ex. She knows more about him than anyone. If we convince her he's dangerous, she'll back us. And residents will believe her. Ethan clenched his fists. Samantha had been out of his life for years, but the breakup was messy. If the HOA reached her first, they could turn her bitterness into ammunition against him. He backed away before they noticed, slipping into the shadows. His lawyer was right. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was a war for control. And now, the HOA was playing dirty. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, mind racing. The board was hiding something bigger than fines, bigger than pride. Why else would they risk so much? Why else would they try to silence him? He knew what had to be done. He would have to expose them, not just legally, but publicly. And to do that, he would need proof of whatever it was they were hiding. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't just defend himself. He would uncover the HOA's darkest secret. But little did he know, the HOA wasn't the only one digging into the past. Someone else had already started watching him. The week after the explosive HOA meeting was strangely quiet. Too quiet. No fines. No letters. No late-night complaints about non-compliant grass. It felt as if the HOA board had simply vanished into thin air. But that peace didn't last. One rainy morning, As I opened my mailbox, a thick, cream-colored envelope sat inside. No HOA logo. No return address. Just my name written in bold black ink. Inside was a legal notice. Not the typical fine or warning, but something far heavier. The HOA wasn't just threatening to foreclose on my property anymore. They had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I was in violation of community trust covenants. At first, I laughed. Community trust? What trust? These people had spent months bleeding me dry with petty fines. But as I kept reading, my stomach dropped. The lawsuit wasn't just about me. It was about every single homeowner in the neighborhood. The HOA accused me of being a rogue landholder who was disrupting their community harmony. The penalty? They wanted me removed from my own home. Asterisk. But here's where the story turned upside down. Tucked inside the lawsuit packet was a copy of the community's original land deed. Someone intentionally or not had attached it. And when I scanned it, my eyes froze on one crucial line. All land rights, easements, and transfers are subject to the original property owner's consent. That's when it hit me. The original property owner wasn't the HOA. It wasn't some developer. It was the man I had bought my house and adjoining land from. And according to the paperwork I had received when I purchased my property years ago, I had inherited those same rights, meaning I didn't just own my house. I didn't just own the yard they fined me over. I owned the land beneath the entire neighborhood. Asterisk. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why the HOA was so aggressive. Why they tried to bully me out. Why they threw massive fines my way. It wasn't about the mailbox paint or the height of my fence. It was about the fact that, legally, they were living on my land. And if I played my cards right, I could turn the entire situation upside down. As I set the letter down, a slow grin spread across my face. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like the victim. No. I was holding the winning hand. And the HOA had no idea what was coming. Asterisk. The night after the shocking town hall meeting, I couldn't sleep. The revelation that I technically owned. The entire neighborhood had already sent ripples through the community, but something else was bothering me. I kept replaying the words of an old man I had briefly seen during the chaos of the meeting. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't panicking. He was just staring at me with piercing eyes, like he already knew what was coming. The next morning, as I stepped outside, there he was, sitting on a wooden bench near the mailbox, as if he had been waiting for me all night. His clothes were old-fashioned, his hands weathered, and his cane tapped rhythmically against the concrete. "You don't know what you're holding, son," he said without introduction. "What do you mean?" I asked, uneasy. "That land deed. It's not just about owning houses. There's a history buried under this neighborhood. Secrets the HOA never wanted you to find." His words hit like a hammer. For a moment, I thought he was just another eccentric old man spinning ghost stories, but then he pulled out a faded map. It was hand-drawn, showing the same plots as the modern deed, but with one chilling detail. There was a massive red X right under where the HOA office currently stood. I leaned closer. "What is this?" "A marker," he said. "A warning. Something buried deep in this land, something they built the neighborhood on top of." Before I could ask more, a black SUV rolled past slowly, its tinted windows glinting in the morning light. The old man immediately stuffed the map back into his coat. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone from that board. And if you value your life, don't dig." Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he stood up, shuffled down the road, and vanished around the corner. I stood frozen, my mind torn in 100 directions. Was this old man a paranoid conspiracy theorist? Or had I just been handed the key to uncovering why the HOA was so desperate to bury me under fines and lawsuits? That night, curiosity won. I unfolded the copy of the deed again and matched it against the old man's map. And there it was, the overlap. The HOA's office was sitting exactly on the red X. I didn't sleep that night either, because now I knew owning their land wasn't the real story. Something much darker was hidden beneath it. Asterisk, I barely slept that night. The HOA's last letter was still lying on my kitchen table, its words etched into my brain like a bad tattoo. Failure to comply will result in legal escalation. Legal escalation? Against me? The guy who literally owned the land under their feet? The audacity was so wild, I actually laughed in the middle of the night, then caught myself staring into the dark. Realizing just how far this could go. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp. Kids rode bikes on the cul-de-sac and neighbors watered lawns that technically were, well, mine. Everyone smiled at me, clueless about the storm brewing behind closed HOA doors. But as I rounded the corner by the clubhouse, I saw something strange. Several cars parked in a neat row, all belonging to the HOA board members. The blinds of the clubhouse windows were drawn, and muffled voices seeped out from the crack in the door. My gut told me this wasn't just a casual gathering. I pulled out my phone and recorded a quick voice memo. 9:47 a.m. HOA holding private meeting, no notice posted. Possible violation of their own bylaws. Irony was my new best friend. I crept closer, pretending to tie my shoe, when a loud voice cut through the walls. "We can't let him win." It was the HOA president, Mrs. Thompson. "If he proves ownership, the entire association collapses." Do you understand what that means? Another voice chimed in, lower, sharper. "We'll bury him in legal fees. He doesn't have the stomach for this. Most people cave when it gets expensive enough." My heart pounded. So this was their plan. Not fairness, not compromise, but intimidation. They weren't trying to enforce community standards. They were trying to break me. And then the twist I didn't see coming. Another man spoke, almost whispering. "What? If he finds out about the original deed transfer? If he digs too deep, we're all in trouble. It's better if we pressure him into selling." Original deed transfer? My mind spun. What were they hiding? I backed away quickly before someone noticed me, adrenaline coursing through my veins. By the time I reached my house, my hands were trembling. This wasn't just about grass height or mailbox colors anymore. Something far bigger was buried in the HOA's past, and I had just stumbled onto it. I brewed a pot of coffee and spread out every document I'd collected so far across my kitchen table. The surveyor's map, the county clerk's notes, my deed, their threatening letters. And now, the words "original deed transfer" echoed in my head like a puzzle piece, just waiting to click into place. I called Mark, my attorney friend, and told him everything I overheard. His silence on the other end lasted a good 5 seconds. "Knaved," he finally said. "If what they're saying is true, you're sitting on a gold mine. There could be fraud here, maybe even criminal activity. But it also means they'll do anything to keep it hidden." His words didn't scare me. They motivated me. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to uncover their secrets, twist by twist, until the whole rotten empire crumbled. And little did I know, the next clue was already waiting for me, buried in the dusty corners of the county archives. The day of the court hearing had finally arrived, and the tension in the air was so thick it felt like a storm waiting to burst. For months, the HOA had painted me as the villain of the neighborhood, the reckless landowner who dared to challenge their authority. The truth was about to come out, and I was ready for it. As I walked into the courthouse, the HOA board members were already seated, dressed in sharp suits and smug expressions. Their president, Richard Caldwell, gave me a smirk that screamed confidence. He whispered something to his lawyer, and they both laughed quietly. They truly believed this was the day they would finally crush me. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment more carefully than they could ever imagine. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The courtroom was filled, not just with lawyers and board members, but also curious residents from the neighborhood. Word had spread that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been bullied, fined, or silenced by the HOA's relentless grip. The HOS lawyer went first, presenting their case with fiery rhetoric. He spoke about how I had deliberately violated multiple HOA codes, how my refusal to comply was creating disorder in the community, and how my actions were setting a dangerous precedent. His voice boomed with conviction, but to me, it all sounded like smoke and mirrors. When it was my turn, I didn't even look at Richard Caldwell or his lawyer. I faced the judge and began with calm, steady words. Your Honor, this case isn't about me breaking HOA rules. This case is about the HOA breaking the law. That one sentence made the entire courtroom go silent. I handed over the documents my legal team had uncovered: property deeds, land surveys, and the original developer's agreements. Piece by piece, I explained how my grandfather's land had never been formally absorbed by the HOA. In fact, the HOA had been illegally extending their authority over property they had no legal right to control. I could see Richard shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His smirk fading then, I dropped the real bombshell. Your Honor, not only did the HOA attempt to fine me illegally, but upon closer inspection of the county records, we discovered something else. My family trust owns a critical portion of land that the HOA has been using for years. This includes the clubhouse, the tennis courts, and even the parking lot. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Even the judge raised his eyebrows. Richard's face turned pale, and his lawyer started flipping through papers nervously. I wasn't. I pulled out photos, maps, and surveys that clearly showed the HOA's prized facilities sitting on land that didn't belong to them. For decades, they had been collecting dues, renting out the clubhouse, and threatening residents over property they technically didn't own. The judge leaned forward. Are you saying the HOA has been profiting from land that belongs to you? Yes. Your Honor, I replied firmly, and I have the legal documents to prove it. The room buzzed with whispers. Residents looked at each other in disbelief, some with smiles creeping onto their faces. For years, they had been paying fees to maintain those very facilities, never knowing that the HOA had no right to control them. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his voice cracking with desperation. This is absurd. We've managed this neighborhood for decades. He can't just come in here and claim ownership. The judge silenced him with a glare. Mr. Caldwell, the documents are clear. If what he's presented is accurate, then this court has some serious decisions to make. That was the moment the tides turned. The HOA had dragged me into court, hoping to bury me under legal fees and public humiliation. Instead, their empire was unraveling before their eyes. Residents began murmuring louder, and I could tell the realization was hitting them. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were standing on stolen ground. As the judge adjourned for the day, he announced that a full investigation would be conducted into the HOA's land claims, finances, and operations. Richard Caldwell's face was red with rage, but there was nothing he could do. His smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the look of a man who knew the walls were closing in. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt the weight of months of battles lift from my shoulders. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't over yet. If the HOA was desperate before, now they were cornered. And cornered enemies are always the most dangerous. The war had only just begun, but for the first time, the battlefield was mine. The community hall was buzzing that evening. Word had spread quickly that Daniel had uncovered shocking documents about the HOA. Dozens of homeowners showed up, their voices echoing off the walls, frustration simmering in the air. Some waved letters of fines. Others carried eviction notices that the HOA had threatened them with. Daniel stood at the front of the room, holding the stack of papers he'd pulled from the courthouse. "These," he announced, raising them high, "are proof that the HOA never had the legal right to enforce fines on any of you. Every fee, every threat, every eviction attempt, they're all built on fraud." The crowd gasped. A woman in the back shouted, "You mean all the thousands I've paid them over the years were illegal?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, and it gets worse. They don't even own the land this entire neighborhood sits on." The room erupted. People shouted over each other, angry and relieved at the same time. But as the noise grew, a slow clap broke the chaos. Everyone turned toward the door. It was Mr. Patterson, the HOA's longtime lawyer. He strolled in calmly, adjusting his tie as though he owned the place. "Bravo, Daniel," he said smoothly. "You've done your homework, but you're playing a dangerous game." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Dangerous for who? For you and your crooked board?" Patterson smirked. "You think this is about the HOA? You're digging into matters that go far beyond homeowners' fees. Do you even realize who you're up against?" The crowd fell silent. A chill ran through the room. Patterson pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the table in front of Daniel. Inside were photos of Daniel's property, his family, even his truck parked in front of his house. On the back of one picture was a message scrawled in bold red ink: "Stop or lose everything." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel clenched his jaw but didn't flinch. "Is that a threat?" Patterson leaned in close enough for only Daniel to hear. "It's a promise. The HOA isn't the real problem here. The people funding them, they won't let you win." For the first time since the fight began, Daniel felt a shiver of doubt. Who were the people Patterson was talking about? And why would anyone with that much power care about a neighborhood? HOA. Before he could respond, a homeowner stood up and shouted, "We're not afraid of you anymore, Patterson. If Daniel owns the land, you've got nothing." The room roared in agreement. But Patterson only smirked, collected his briefcase, and walked out. As he left, he turned back one last time. "Enjoy your little victory. You'll wish you never found those papers." Daniel stood there, his fists clenched, his mind racing. The battle with the HOA was no longer just about fines or land ownership. Something far bigger and darker was hiding in the shadows, and Patterson had just confirmed it. The room was tense as Mark sat at the long mahogany table across from the HOA board. For the first time since this battle began, they weren't smirking, mocking, or casually flipping through paperwork as if they had the upper hand. Instead, their expressions were tight, their eyes darting toward one another like trapped animals searching for an escape route. Mark leaned back in his chair, deliberately calm. His attorney slid a thick folder across the table, every page meticulously organized. "Here," the attorney said with quiet authority. "These documents show not only that Mr. Walker owns the land this neighborhood is built on, but also that the HOA has been operating unlawfully for years, collecting fines, charging fees, and enforcing rules without legal standing." The president of the HOA, a sharp-faced woman named Linda, tried to interrupt. "That's ridiculous. We've been operating legally for decades. Every homeowner here signed our agreements." Mark raised an eyebrow and cut her off. "Agreements? For what? To follow the rules of an HOA that doesn't even exist legally? You've been playing dress-up with authority you never had, and now the bill has come due." The board members fidgeted, and for the first time, Mark saw fear flicker across their faces. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every homeowner in the subdivision, their money, their trust, and their belief that the HOA had any real power. The attorney continued, "We'll be filing a lawsuit not just to recover the illegal fines, but also damages for harassment, misuse of funds, and fraudulent operation. Once this hits the court, every homeowner is going to learn that the board they've trusted for years is nothing more than a group of imposters." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Finally, Linda slammed her fist against the table. "You think you can scare us with paperwork? The homeowners trust us, not you. You're an outsider who moved in and decided to cause chaos." Mark's lips curved into a slow smile. "Funny, that's exactly what I thought about you." But then, instead of pushing the point, he stood up and walked toward the window, letting the silence drag. Outside, he could see the manicured lawns, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the families who'd spent years living under the HOA's thumb. He thought about the old man who'd been fined for leaving his garbage bins out an hour too long. The single mother who'd been threatened with foreclosure for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue. The couple forced to remove a swing set because it didn't fit the community aesthetic. Mark turned back to the board. "You've been terrorizing people, ordinary families who just want to live their lives. And you think that's leadership? No, that ends now. You're not facing just me anymore. You're facing every homeowner you've ever wronged." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger man named Derek, finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if? What if he's right?" Linda shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare start doubting now." But the seed of fear had been planted. Mark saw it. He could see Derek's eyes flicking toward the folder of evidence, toward the thought of lawsuits and public humiliation. He could see the weight of years of corruption pressing down on board. And for the first time, Mark felt the tide turning in his favor as the meeting broke up. The HOA tried to maintain their composure, but Mark knew the battle lines had shifted. They weren't predators anymore. They were prey, walking out of that room. Mark felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd ever been bullied, fined, or pushed around by an HOA that thought it was untouchable. And in that moment, he knew this war was far from over. But now, he wasn't just defending. He was on the attack. Asterisk. The boardroom was heavy with silence as I laid the ancient deed on the polished oak table. The HOA members sat stiff, their smugness replaced with unease. Each one leaned forward, eyes wide, as though the old parchment itself had claws ready to strike. I unrolled the document with deliberate slowness. The parchment had been sealed, stamped, and preserved by generations before me. It wasn't just paper, it was a weapon. My weapon. "Do you know what this means?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp, like a blade cutting through the tension. They exchanged nervous glances. Mark, the HOA's president, swallowed hard. "You think this deed scares us? It's just old paperwork. Our bylaws supersede whatever relic you think you own." I smiled. "That's the thing, Mark. This isn't just a relic. It's the foundation of this neighborhood. And it says, very clearly, that every single inch of land you built your precious homes on still belongs to my family trust. The HOA doesn't own the land. They're all tenants." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sarah, usually the quiet one on the board, broke the silence. "That can't be right. We bought our homes fair and square. We've been paying mortgage, property taxes, everything. This is impossible." I tapped the line in the deed. "Read it yourself." The ownership was never transferred. Developers built over it, banks financed it, HOAs enforced rules on it. But at the root, it all traces back here. The shock on their faces was satisfying, but it wasn't finished. And here's the twist. Your $250,000 fine, that's void. In fact, the HOA doesn't have legal grounds to fine me or anyone because your authority rests on land you don't own. The room erupted. Shouts, protests, even curses filled the air. Mark slammed his fist on the table. You're bluffing. We'll take this to court. Perfect, I said smoothly. Because in court, everything comes out. Every hidden clause, every misuse of funds, every intimidation tactic you've used to squeeze homeowners dry. And guess what? Once it's public that this neighborhood has been built on a legal illusion, the homeowners will come after you, not me. Their faces turned pale. They realized the storm I was about to unleash. But I wasn't done. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so it carried more weight. There's something else you should know. This deed, this paper, it gives me more than ownership. It gives me rights over the community funds, the HOA accounts, and even the rental. Income's tied to this land. Everything you've collected for years, I can claim it. Sarah gasped again. No, that would bankrupt us. Families. I cut her off. Families? Don't pretend you care about families. You've bullied single mothers into paying fines for leaving toys on their lawns. You've forced retirees to repaint fences 3 times a year. You've acted like kings in a kingdom you never owned. And now justice has arrived. For the first time, I saw real fear in Mark's eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. But before I could savor the moment, something unexpected happened. Board member at the far end, a man named David, who had been silent all evening, cleared his throat. There's something you don't know, he said, his voice steady but dark. That deed you're waving around? It's only half the story. The room froze. All eyes turned to him. I frowned. What do you mean? David leaned forward, his lips curling into the faintest smile. Because the original developers anticipated this. They knew about your family's ownership, and they made an agreement decades ago. An agreement that might just destroy everything you think you've won. My chest tightened. A ripple of unease spread across me. What agreement? Why hadn't? My grandfather mentioned this. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick with yellowed papers. He slid it across the table toward me. You're not the only one with old secrets. The air felt colder suddenly, as though the weight of decades was pressing down on us all. I hesitated before touching the folder, knowing that whatever was inside could flip the entire game on its head. For the first time since this battle began, doubt crept into my mind, and that's when I realized this war wasn't overdone. It was just beginning. The courtroom was packed tighter than a church on Easter Sunday. Every seat was filled with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers who had caught wind of the bizarre legal battle between the HOA and the man they had once mocked me. The tension hung heavy in the air, almost electric, as if the whole room knew that something monumental was about to happen. The HOA board members sat in a stiff row, their designer suits neatly pressed, their smug expressions betraying no fear. But I could see it in their eyes, the unease, the cracks in their perfect facade. Across from them sat my lawyer, Jordan, calm as ever, his stack of documents neatly arranged like weapons ready for war. When the judge entered, the room fell into silence. He was a stern man, with years of experience written in the lines across his face. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the docket before clearing his throat. Case number 3827. Greenfield Estates HOA versus Mr. Daniel Walker. The opening. Arguments were predictable. The HOA painted me as a reckless homeowner who had violated community harmony by allowing unapproved modifications on my property. They claimed I owed over $250,000 in fines. Their lawyer, a slick-tongued professional, spoke with the confidence of someone who thought the outcome was already secured. But then it was Jordan's turn. He stood slowly, straightened his tie, and began not with documents or accusations, but with a story. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing the floor, "this case is not about a man who broke rules. It's about an organization that overstepped its authority, manipulated its power, and in doing so, forgot something very important. They forgot who actually owns this land." He let that last sentence hang in the air like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I watched as the HOA president, Mr. Harris, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew what was coming. Jordan began to lay out the evidence. First came the property deeds, documents tracing back decades, showing how the land Greenfield Estates was built on had never been fully transferred to the HOA's control. Instead, through a clerical oversight buried in old county records, I had inherited full ownership rights when I purchased my lot. The HOA's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. The documents were clear, signed, sealed, and verified. Then came the twist no one saw coming. Jordan revealed that technically, every homeowner in the neighborhood was leasing the land from me. Their carefully manicured lawns, their pristine driveways, their cookie-cutter houses, all of it sat on property I owned. The HOA had been enforcing rules on land that wasn't legally theirs. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few. Nervous laughs echoed against the walls. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the headline of the year. The HOA board members paled, their composure cracking. Mr. Harris leaned over to whisper frantically to his lawyer, but it was too late. The truth was out, undeniable and devastating. The judge banged his gavel to restore order. Quiet in the courtroom. Jordan pressed on, delivering the killing blow. Not only do they lack the authority to fine my client, but by collecting fees and enforcing penalties on property they don't own, they may have committed fraud. This is not just a civil matter anymore. This may very well be criminal. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear in the eyes of the HOA. Real, unshakable fear. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We will need to review this evidence in detail. But I must say, at first glance, this changes everything." As I sat there, heart pounding, I realized something profound. The balance of power had shifted. For months, I had been the one under attack, the one fighting to protect my rights. But now the HOA was the one on trial, and I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner who had ever been bullied, threatened, or extorted by an HO, a drunk on power. This was no longer about fines. This was about justice, and I was ready to see it through to the end. Asterisk. The courthouse was packed tighter than a can of sardines. Local news crews jostled for camera space. Neighbors whispered anxiously, and the HOA board members sat stiff as marble statues at the defense table. At the center of it all sat me, calm but firm, with stacks of files and a quiet fire in my chest. This was the day everything would come full circle. The judge entered, her gavel striking once. Court is now in session. My attorney, Rachel, leaned toward me. "This is it. Once we present the final deed and the auditor's findings, they won't have anywhere to hide." I nodded, eyes on the HOA president, Barbara, who looked pale and twitchy. For months, they had tried to bury me under false fines, intimidation, and threats. But today, the truth would bury them. Asterisk. The HOA's lawyer droned on first, painting me as a rogue landowner who was destabilizing the community with frivolous lawsuits. Their arguments sounded sharp on the surface until Rachel stood. "Your Honor," she said, projecting her voice so everyone heard. "The HOA is attempting to enforce rules on land they do not legally own. In fact, their entire neighborhood sits on property purchased and held by my client's late grandfather. A ripple of gasps filled the room. Barbara's lips tightened. Rachel held up the century-old deed. This document predates the HOA itself. Furthermore, my client inherited not only his home but the land beneath every house in this development. Meaning every fine levied, every rule enforced, was based on authority they never had. The judge adjusted her glasses. And you can. Prove this? Rachel smiled. Not just prove it. We have records from the county auditor, for a auditor, showing that for decades the HOA collected money illegally overcharging homeowners, laundering it through shell accounts and pocketing funds. Another wave of shock crashed through the courtroom. Neighbors whispered, some glaring at the HOA board in disgust. Barbara slammed her palm on the table. Lies! All lies! She shouted. The judge silenced her with a sharp glare. You'll remain quiet, or I'll hold you in contempt. Asterisk. Rachel wasn't done. And there's one more thing. She pulled out a thin envelope and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The judge opened it, eyes widening slightly as she read. This is a letter from the county treasurer's office. It states that the HOA not only collected illegal fines, but used community funds to finance private vacations, personal renovations, and even political donations. Is that correct? Rachel nodded. Every cent traced. Every transaction logged. The courtroom erupted. Homeowners shouted in outrage, many standing to their feet. Cameras flashed. Barbara's face went from pale to beet red. Asterisk. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly until the noise died down. She leaned forward. After reviewing the evidence, I hereby rule that the HOA acted outside its authority, illegally collected funds, and engaged in fraudulent activity. Effective immediately, the HOA is dissolved. Control of the land and properties reverts to the legal owner, Mr. Adam Carter. The gavel came down like thunder. Furthermore, restitution will be ordered. Every homeowner who paid fines is entitled to compensation to be taken directly from the HOA's misused funds. And the HOA board members will face criminal investigation. The room exploded. Cheers, tears, and applause rang out as cameras rolled. Asterisk. Barbara and the board were led out in handcuffs, faces twisted in humiliation. Neighbors surrounded me, shaking my hand, some even apologizing for doubting me. You saved us, one man said, eyes wet. You exposed them, I smiled faintly. No, I just made sure the truth came out. As the courthouse emptied, Rachel clapped me on the shoulder. Adam, you didn't just win a case. You changed everything. This community's free now. Asterisk. Weeks later, I stood at the edge of the neighborhood, watching kids play in yards, families barbecuing, laughter replacing the constant tension of harassment. The old signs and rule boards had been torn down. Freedom had returned. I pulled out the deed one last time. The paper yellowed, but still strong. My grandfather's legacy. My inheritance. The HOA thought they could bury me under $250,000 in fines. Instead, they buried themselves under the weight of their lies. And now, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was the landlord of an entire neighborhood, and the man who ended the tyranny of an HOA forever.